Welcome to this edition of the Talk of Simsbury. My name is Dominique Avery. Today we're going to focus on the 2014 legislative session, which ended on May 7th. Joining me for this discussion, as they did just before the session, are our local legislators, State Representative John Hampton and State Senator Kevin Witkos. Also joining us today for the first time is Hartford Courant State Capitol Bureau Chief Chris Keating, who just happens to be a Simsbury resident. Welcome to all of you. I'm so glad you're here today.
Thank you, Dominique.
Yes, thanks for having us.
It's a political year with both our legislative guests running for re-election as well as the governor. And I know politics influence the session, but I'd like to try and keep politics out of our discussion as much as possible and try more to let people know what actually happened during the session and what might impact their lives. Chris, I'm going to start with you. First, I want to welcome you to SCTV for the first time. Also want to congratulate you on the 2 awards you just won from the Society of Professional Journalists. Congratulations.
Yes,
Thank
absolutely.
you.
Congratulations.
And maybe you can start by giving us sort of an overview. I know a lot happened of the sort of the highs and lows of the legislative session, the winners and losers, if you will.
Well, the session was very, very busy. It was a short session in an election year, as they call it, but you'd never know that by the amount of work that gets done. Give or take 13 weeks. The budget normally dominates things, and we can talk about that a little bit, and all the offshoots of the budgets, including not only the implementer bill, but everything that is part of the budget. So this year, one of the big things that came out at the beginning was the rebates were announced, that there were going to be rebates. Fast forward 3 or 4 months, and it turned out there were no rebates.
That was an issue because of the deficit,
because of the surplus. That's correct.
Surplus or lack of surplus. Right.
The surplus had been projected at $500 million or more, which is a good piece of change, even by state standards. But it turned out there were a series of miscalculations on the surplus, and the surplus basically went down to about $43 million. And that is for the fiscal year that we're currently in right now, that ends on June 30th. So when the projected surplus goes way down, it limits what everybody can do. But there were a million other issues, a minimum wage, a whole series of things. Some people were happy, some people were not happy. Keno did not get in there. Keno was going to be in the budget. There was a big struggle over that. We could talk about that. So there were all these different elements that were, as I said, part of them or many of them are directly related to the budget, but others such as minimum wage were not. And then I know we had a big water bill, and there's somebody on the panel who could go into detail on that. And all in all, I would say a fair amount was accomplished, but it also may be known as a session of what did not happen. In other words, no rebates, no Keno, no large surplus, but many, many programs were funded, and many things get through. There's no Sunday bow hunting for anyone who's interested in that. So there's a whole series of people who are happy and sad, and many sessions actually end up quite like that.
Okay, so I think we'll go back to more general discussions. I wanted to give our 2 guests a chance to. You mentioned the water bill. I think that's probably what, John, what you would call your proudest accomplishment. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Well, first and foremost, thank you, Dominique, for hosting this wonderful show, and for SCTV for filming it, and to Senator Witkos and Chris. And I need to exercise a point of personal privilege and congratulate our hostess, who received the Hometown Hero Award last evening in Simsbury. Well deserved. Volunteers like Dominique make Simsbury run and so successful, so we're very proud.
Thank you, John.
Quick plug. But this session was very exciting. It was my first short session as a legislator, and I was proud of the water bill and grateful to Senator Witkos for supporting it early on and helping me at the last minute to push it over the finish line. The impetus of this bill came out of the University of Connecticut's attempt to divert water by MDC from the Farmington River to support growth up in Yukon. So I said to myself, that just doesn't seem right environmentally and economically, and well, let's look at our statewide water plan, and what does that say? Well, Connecticut didn't have one. So we convened all the great minds and stakeholders and put together legislation that will require a statewide water plan by 2018 that will affect our environment, address our environment, economic development, public safety, emergency preparedness, drought. And it was a nail biter and a great first, exciting too as a freshman to have legislation passed in a bipartisan way. We had both sides of the aisle joining on, and a lot of environmental groups and a lot of people to thank. So I'm really excited about it. Proud of it.
Oh, thank you, John. Kevin, let's turn to you. You're in the minority. You have less power than the Democratic majority. What would you cite as something that you're happiest about?
Well, I will say that we serve in 2-year terms, and each of the legislative sessions this past term were very polarizing. The first term happened to deal with the massacre that took place down in Newtown. And the second session that we just completed, it was polarizing in watching the House and the Senate Democrats fall apart because they had an issue with each other in their leaderships, and just sitting on the sideline waiting to see what's going to happen next. It wasn't until the very end of the session where bills started moving. And so that was very interesting to see happen because I had never seen that before.
No, I was going to ask Chris about that. Chris, I want to come back to you on that. Go ahead.
But I think one of the highlights of the session this year was the funding of the UTC program to keep United Technologies in our state. A lot of people don't understand the mechanics behind that. We allowed UTC to claim the tax credits that they already earned in the amount of $400 million, but it's far-reaching than that. They are the largest private employer that we have in the state of Connecticut. They have over 2,500 individual contracts with companies located here in the state of Connecticut, and over 700 of those companies have $100,000 or more contracts. So if they decided to leave our state, it would have decimated our economy. We always talk about jobs in the economy. Well, that would have had a massive negative effect on our economy. And don't be fooled to think that they wouldn't leave, because we saw that happen to Lockheed Martin in California. They decided, well, we're picking up and we're leaving. They moved to South Carolina and North Carolina. So large companies can do that. So I think that was a proud accomplishment for us to pass in the General Assembly.
Interesting. So let me turn to you, Chris, again. There was something very unusual about this session. Usually there are fights between Democrats and Republicans, but this year it seemed that everything was bottled up because there was a fight between the House and Senate Democrats. Can you enlighten us a little bit about what was going on?
Well, it kind of, believe it or not, it went back to an issue called the GMO grass. It had to do with, Monsanto and all these big companies are involved. The GMO bill was big last year in the first year of the 2-year session.
Can you just explain what GMO is quickly?
Genetically modified organisms, I guess, basically. Yeah. It has to do with things that are in food, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And Don Williams, who is leaving the Senate this year, had a bit of a pet bill, an environmental bill that passed in the Senate. And everybody, I don't know if everybody assumed it would go in the House. People were assuming it just might die in the House and nothing would happen till the end of the session, and then they would just say, oh, we didn't have time to get to it. What happened instead was they voted on it in the House pretty much right away, and they voted it down, which is extremely rare. In other words, your viewers may know, in the legislature, they don't want to vote against anything, so they just don't vote. It's very, very rare that something would be affirmatively voted down, because then they could say, Senator so-and-so voted against something. The way they like to do it is they just have no vote at all and let time expire. But what happened in the House was they actually voted it down, and Speaker Sharkey, because I asked him, I said, has it ever happened? Have you ever seen it where a speaker called a bill in the House and voted against it and it went down? And he said, no, he had never seen that. And I had never seen that. I've been there for a while now, about 20 years off and on. And it just doesn't happen. So the short answer is sometimes personal bills, for lack of a better term, personally supported bills by the House Speaker or the Senate President either get or don't get a life of their own. And they can kind of potentially spin out of control. And a lot of times the Senate will wait till the end to pass House bills, and the House will wait to pass Senate bills. This goes all the way back. The best guy that I ever saw who was at it was Bill DeBella, when he was really powerful in the Senate. And people in the House were afraid of him. And he had a tremendous amount of power. I'd say probably more than anyone who's there now. the way that he handled it when Weicker was governor way back then. But anyway, make a long story short, is yes, a lot of things were bottled up, and until a logjam is broken, things don't move and you can't get things done.
So did they hold a bill hostage? Did the Senate hold a bill that Sharkey wanted hostage?
Yeah, there was a so-called reverse pilot, is what they call it, was Sharkey's bill, and the bottom line was that never got called. It never got called in the end. But eventually, a lot of House bills did go through the Senate. It's amazing. I think there was over 50 bills easily on the consent calendar, which they do in the Senate. They don't do that in the House.
Maybe Kevin, maybe you can explain. I don't mean to interrupt
Yes,
you.
no, jump in.
What the consent calendar is in the Senate? You're a Republican. You don't set the consent calendar, but you do vote on it.
Well, you do have a say in the consent calendar. A consent calendar is something that's been discussed both in the Democratic caucus and in the Republican caucus.
Yep.
Nobody has any issues with it. Nobody's going to offer any amendments to it, and it just speeds the process up a little bit longer. So most of the times, other than the last day, we've had a thorough examination of the bill, and we agreed to put it on consent calendar so we can move a lot of our business in a shorter period of time.
For example, my water bill, Kevin was kind enough to help get that on the consent calendar to move it forward. That was one of many.
Sure.
I mean, large.
Chris
So-
said we're probably 50 bills in 2 minutes.
And which
Right.
helps allow that. In other words, if you had to debate the water bill, who knows what could
Time
have
could
happened?
run- time
Could have
could
been
run out.
delayed. Time could have run out or whatever. But if you can get the water bill on the consent calendar and you know there's going to be a vote on that, then it goes through. I don't think John cares whether it's a 33-3 vote or a 36-0. He could probably care less.
So the consent calendar is a calendar where both sides agree that they have some debate, but they won't take the vote. They won't make the people go through the vote to tally.
One
all the
member
things
has
that are-
the authority to say, I don't want it on the consent calendar, and have it removed, and there'll have to be an individual vote on that one specific bill
Is that that's the Senate rule?
in the Senate, yeah.
Okay.
One member can request to be taken off the consent calendar.
Yeah, they're basically they're unanimous votes where nobody causes any problems and nobody pushes for any amendments, as you said. Unanimous votes and everyone says, okay, it's good, it can go.
We
So-
tend to do that with judges on the House side and nominations, things
Right.
like that
Yeah.
I've seen.
So I heard a great deal about fracking and glass eels at the last minute. What was that all about? Anybody?
Legislation this year, which I supported, would put a 3-year moratorium on fracking waste in the state of Connecticut. It was a pretty contentious going. There were a couple iterations, as I recall, and that passed at the last minute.
It started out as a ban on taking fracking waste,
Correct.
and then there was a compromise
And then
which
there's
made it a
the,
moratorium.
It was a lengthy debate in the Senate. I think it went on for 7 hours. I think this debate surrounded the fact that we don't drill for natural gas in the state of Connecticut. Why are we banning a product that there's no way we'll be drilling in Connecticut? Because we don't have the shale gas that in our state. So we're passing a law to prevent something that doesn't make any sense. But at the end of the day, it's we're going to study it. So it's not a total ban. And the law says just you can't store it in the state of Connecticut. So if there's waste that's going to be sent to another state that will accept it, maybe for a fee of storage, we'll allow them to pass through the state of Connecticut, but they just won't be able to store the waste of fracking gas in our state.
So so there was a trade-off that I read about glass eels. What are glass eels, and what did that have to do with anything? What was that?
Well, that's a House bill. Representative Craig Minor from up in the Litchfield Hills area. It came out of the Sportsman Caucus. And they look like salamanders, but they're actually fairly translucent in color. And they're a delicacy in China. And we will be the third state in our country that allows the farming of those. And most of them are up in Maine and the northern country, because that's where I guess they like that kind of habitat. And they sell at a very high price. People are making over $200,000 from what I'm told. So
So
here
somebody
we go.
wanted that.
Not something that I think I'd probably want to try to eat, but
It came up at the last minute. I know Mary Mashinsky was involved in that as well, and but there's now a push to veto it. Have the governor veto that. Have you heard that?
Interesting.
Yeah.
No, well, the vetoes, Malloy has surprised me with the vetoes in the past, where, in other words, you would think, theoretically, House and Senate are both Democratic, and you would think most of the things that went through. I think one of the years he vetoed 8 bills or something. So, in other words, sometimes you don't know. You don't know, or at least I don't know, on Malloy, if you're just assuming, the House and Senate passed it. And sometimes he has vetoed bills that passed by wide margins. wide margins.
It's going to be interesting.
I don't know on this one. John's
Yeah.
more clued in. I'm not saying he's vetoing this one. I don't know.
What's going to be interesting is the chocolate milk. Will he veto that? Because that was a line in an education bill, which was technical in nature.
Right.
That's the way it was told to the legislators. And so, will the information that was contained in that bill, can we put that off for another year until we come back again? I don't know. So the governor doesn't have line item veto, so he can't just take that one line and say, well, we're going to strike that language out. So he's going to weigh this big education bill versus this one language.
Yeah.
And it's not just the fact that the schools can look the other way, because apparently it's tied to federal funding. So it is a major concern that everybody's kind of waiting on bated breath to see what the governor's going to do.
But some people have said, oh, that's one of those rats that somebody wanted chocolate milk banned, but it doesn't appear to be that way. It had something to do with salt and the salt content of chocolate milk.
There were merits behind it. It was definitely, I thought.
I don't know.
There's a legislator who had pet bills that wanted to, and he's not going to be there next year, he's retiring, that wanted to do something with the type of milk that is sold, the type of juices that are sold. So why I don't have proof? Similar to how did the Keno end up in and nobody wants to claim that. The same thing with this language, that it was designed for a purpose. Because why would you insert this bill into an education bill that says if the level of potassium in this container is X, then it's prohibited in the sale of public schools. So.
And it's usually only veteran legislators who can pull this off. John Fonfara in the bond package, this bond package is this huge, and he gets a line in there that you have to keep Flower Street open because the busway is going there. It's very few people in the legislature could have got that in, would even have thought to get it in, and would have had the power to get it in a gigantic bill like that kind of at the last minute, and nobody noticed.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you, Chris, how does he do that? Does he go to LCO, the people who write the bill, and say he wants that in there? How does he do that?
Usually, yeah. Generally, you would have to be a committee chair, as far as I can know.
And
these guys can explain more. Either a committee chair or the speaker or the Senate president. No freshman legislator is going to be able to pull that off. It just doesn't work that way. And he was able to do it, and also he's the guy presenting the bond package. All right, so in other words, he's explaining it on the floor of the Senate, and the first thing he said was not, "Oh yeah, we're keeping Flower Street open." It never came up. But he is very, very concerned about Flower Street. He could, if you had him on the show here, he could talk about it for half an hour. He doesn't think it's right. The road is blocked there where Etna is. I'm sure you know the area. But again, very few people could have gotten it in without anyone noticing, which is what happened.
Right.
So I promised to talk about the impact that the legislative session had on ordinary people, and I noticed that a bill to allow people to find out if they're adopted, find out who who their parents might have been, or some information about that. I thought that might have an impact on people. And the other thing that I thought was the nurse practitioners bill. Somebody want to jump in and talk about those two bills and explain what they are?
Yeah, absolutely. On the APRN bill, which
Nurse
was
practitioners.
Nurse practitioners was a pretty contentious debate. I got a lot of constituent input on it from both the nurses and the doctors, and both sides presented compelling cases. But SB 36 ultimately passed, giving more autonomy to APRNs and giving patients the option to use APRNs, and that did pass successfully.
And can somebody talk about the adoption bill and what that means?
Okay.
Kevin?
Basically, it was sponsored by a state representative who was adopted and was looking for his natural birth parents. Part of it, the claim is for medical reasons, to know the family history. I think the state of Connecticut changed forms when you gave a child up for adoption. I don't remember the year, I think it was in the 80s, early 80s, that said you may be contacted in the future if you're giving a child up for adoption. If you don't, you can sign this form. So they're allowing now the parents post 1984 or 1985, whenever they change that form, that if an 18-year-old wants to seek to reach his parents, they'll have that ability. Or there'll be a mechanism, there'll be a card that says, I don't want you to contact me, but you'll be able to get the medical records. So at least if there's family history, if heart disease or something, you'll have access to those type of records.
So now that bill took a long time to get through. I remember Bill Finch trying to get that through years ago. He's now the mayor of Bridgeport, and he failed and failed and failed. And this year, it was its time?
It was pushed by David Alexander, who's a fellow freshman from Enfield, and I applaud his efforts to
I supported the bill. I think you did too.
Yeah.
But the problem was that folks
Yeah.
thought that people would be less apprehensive of giving up children for adoption.
Yeah.
They may go another route.
Yeah, there were some
And
compelling
so that was
arguments on
the
the other
argument
side.
on the other side.
Yeah, and years ago it was vetoed by Governor Rell. It's a very emotional thing. There's
Sure.
some parents who, for whatever reason, and you can talk about it all day, it's very emotional, who for some reason gave the child up for adoption and did not want to see the kid, did not want the child to come back 25 years later and say, are you my mother, are you my father, or whatever the case may be. So anyway, my recollection is it was vetoed by Governor Rell back in '06, a long time ago,
Right.
and Finch was pushing for this a long time ago.
Right.
And yes, it's for people post, I believe you have to be born after 83 or 84. So in other words, if you were born in 1962, this doesn't cover you.
Right.
It's too late for based on the laws.
So another bill that that I thought might impact a lot of people is the robocalls bill. I just saw we're recording today. This show's going to air for about a month, but the governor signed it today. Somebody want to explain what that means, what that's going to mean for people in terms of robocalls? Does it change, Kevin?
Well, you can get on the do not call list,
Right.
basically, and the robocalls, they have to terminate once you hang up. Sometimes the other end will keep you on hold. So if you pick your phone back again, it's still on the line. So this has, I think you have a 3-second termination. Otherwise, they're going to be held liable for up to an $11,000 fine. We've added text messages to that too. So if you get these unwarranted text messages from somebody, you can go online
On your
and
cell
add your
phones.
cell phone,
Yeah.
have that taken out. But the legislature did exclude political robocalls. So,
Oh, God.
I promise I'm not going to do any on my campaign this year. But since the legislature makes a law, they made a carve out for
Right.
themselves to say you can still receive, even though you're on the do not call list, you can still receive political calls.
But it will be helpful to residents who have certainly had enough of the robocalls.
Robocalls
Right.
and those text messages
Yeah.
that, right.
I know.
Yeah, so it's basically like junk mail on your
Spam,
text,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Luckily, I've avoided that. So, but anyway.
I've gotten a few. Ignition interlock devices. I made a note. I didn't make a note of what happened, but that something changed in the law.
It's an enhancement to the device that's on your car for folks who are mandated to use a breathalyzer who've had DWIs, and it did pass.
Yeah, it passed. You have to blow into it for first-time offenders now too.
Yeah.
You have to blow into the machine to activate your vehicle. If you have a percentage of blood alcohol content in your breath, it won't start the car. But it also reduces the amount of time of a suspension period, because before if you failed the test, you were licensed to suspended for 90 days. Now, as long as you have this interlock ignition device in your car, you're only suspended for 45 days.
And to my knowledge, Mothers Against Drunk Driving was against it, which I'm sorry, was for the bill. Is what I meant by that.
Right.
And sometimes if they're not on board, it's hard to get a consensus on something of
Sure.
that nature.
Okay, so this is something that might not impact that many people, but Chris, maybe I'm going to ask you about it. The Sandy Hook task force that made recommendations about disclosure of crime victims, and that didn't go anywhere.
Right.
This task force met for months and came up with recommendations that were so
That's right.
controversial.
Last year, a bill was passed that essentially created the task force.
Right.
All right. So then, basically, a 17-member task force does all this work, and they made recommendations, and that is correct. None of their recommendations are going anywhere. A lot of that had to do with Don Williams. Did not think that should go forward. That can be a complicated issue, but part of what had been passed was restrictions on 911 calls, which if you watch television at night, CNN, much less TMZ, the 911 calls are out like that.
Right.
Something
Everywhere
happens
else but here.
Yeah, something happens in Georgia or something bad, and suddenly you're hearing the 911 call literally within 24 hours. I mean, all you have to do is watch television. So anyway, they were trying to put restrictions on those things, and not only 911 calls, the calls back and forth in between the police. Kevin should explain some of this, but in other words, and there were obviously very bad things happened at Sandy Hook, but the other thing I would want to add is a lot of the things that we were told about Sandy Hook were not true. We were told, and I listened to all the 911 tapes from Sandy Hook, we were told that on those tapes that you could hear, frankly, the children screaming and shots going off and a cause and effect as if they're being shot right there. I didn't hear anything like that. And the judge, that case went to, if not a whole-blown trial, went to a hearing. The judge said, I don't want to listen to these tapes, but I'm going to listen to them, and I'll probably get back to you in 2 weeks with a decision. He came back the next day because he listened to them. They were very straightforward, professional 911 calls, and they did not have any of the types of information that we were told that were in there. And the bottom line is they were all released. I'm sure you could probably get them on the internet now. I only listened to them once. Maybe the average person doesn't want to listen to them, but they didn't have the types of information on there that we were told that were there.
So is this issue going to come up again next year?
It could among people who want to repeal it back more. In other words, more pro-FOI.
Want more disclosure.
As opposed to anti-FOI. But Kevin was a police officer for however many long. Maybe he should weigh in on this whole thing.
Okay, but I have to stop
Sorry.
because we're almost out of time.
The next show.
The next show. And I wanted to give you all a chance to tell a little bit about your background. We've learned that Kevin was a police officer, but we don't really have time because we've talked so much. We could have done the show for an hour.
Next time.
So thank you for being here. Our time is up. Thanks to everyone here at SCTV for getting the show on the air. Thanks especially to my guests, John Hampton, Kevin Witkos, and Chris Keating for the first time. And finally, thank you for joining us. If you missed any portion of this show, you can find it on our website at simsburytv.org. I'm Dominique Avery. See you the next time for the Talk of Simsbury.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.